Hello, my name is KC Richardson, and I am a professor of biblical studies at Hope International University. And in this particular session, we'll be taking a look at the book of Exodus and discussing some of its contents and major themes. Let's begin by taking a look at a few introductory type issues. First of all, with regard to title, we know this book as the book of Exodus, but actually this was not the original title. Exodus is a Greek word, and it comes from, and it's the title given to this document by the Septuagint. And remember, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which comes about in the 3rd century BC. The original title of this book comes from the Hebrew, and it's translated as "These Are the Names." Now that seems like kind of a strange title. Where does it come from? Well, the practice of the Hebrew people when giving titles to the biblical books was to take the first few words of the composition. And so in this case, in this document, "These Are the Names" are the first words of the text and then become the title for the book. And the names refers to the names of the children of Israel who migrate from Canaan into Egypt, which serves as the setting for the narrative in this book. Now, with regard to the place of Exodus in the biblical canon, Exodus is the second book of the Hebrew Bible, and as such, it's the second book of the Pentateuch. The word Pentateuch means the 5 scrolls. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament are referred to as the Pentateuch, and Exodus is the second of these. Now, in Hebrew tradition, this is referred to as the Pentateuch is referred to as the books of the Torah, and the word Torah means instruction. And so these first 5 books of the Hebrew canon are the most authoritative books in the Hebrew Bible. This is where we find the stories of the patriarchs, the founding fathers of Israel. It's in the Pentateuch or the Torah we find the law of Israel. And in the book of Exodus, we find that formative event in Israel's history, which really constitutes them as the people of God. Now, what is the basic storyline of this document? The basic storyline is that God liberates his people Israel from their slavery in Egypt. And this is, as I mentioned, the formative event in the history of Israel. And it's the event that the people of Israel, all throughout their history, will always back upon that as that which made them God's special, chosen people. Now, who was the author of Exodus? Traditionally, the authorship of this book is attributed to Moses. Moses is the author of Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch. A lot of modern scholars, though, have some questions about this, and probably the greatest objection to the idea that Moses actually sat down and wrote Exodus and the rest of the books of the Pentateuch is, in an oral culture which ancient Israel was, would it make much sense to actually have a written document? Would it have much authority? For us in the modern world, written documents have authority, but in the ancient world, in an oral culture, that wouldn't necessarily have been the case. That being said, however, Moses certainly is the central human figure in this book. He's the one who is considered to be the greatest of all leaders in ancient Israel. He was the greatest of all prophets, and in tradition it was believed that another like Moses would eventually rise up again someday in the future to lead Israel. And so Moses certainly is the central, authoritative human character in this biblical book. And so in that sense, it would make sense to see him as the author in the sense that he's the authority behind this text. Now, the story of the Exodus event takes place in the first 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. But actually, it's a story that begins prior to this, in the last part of the book of Genesis. And it answers the question of why Israel was in Egypt. It really starts with the story of Joseph. Now, you might remember the story of Joseph from Genesis chapters 37 through 50. Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob, remember, was a patriarch, and he was given the name of Israel by God. And so his sons are the 12, kind of the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. And he doesn't really do anything to sort of hide or disguise his favoritism for Joseph. He gives him special privileges, he gives him a special gift, and Joseph himself isn't very discreet about trying to keep all of this a secret. He flaunts his favored status before his brothers. So all this leads to resentment and envy on the part of his brothers. And so because of this, his brothers sell him into slavery. Joseph ends up as a slave in Egypt. Eventually, because of false accusations, he finds himself as a prisoner in Egypt. But because of his special abilities to interpret dreams, Joseph is able to get out of prison and actually becomes a high-up official in the administration of the king of Egypt. And all this is God working through his situation for his long-term goals. Now, eventually, many years later, a famine hits in Canaan, and so Joseph's family, his brothers and their families, have to go in search of food. And so they migrate to Egypt, which was kind of the breadbasket of the ancient world. And there they encountered Joseph. They don't recognize him at first. It's been many years. But Joseph now is a high-up official who's in charge of the food supply of Egypt. And an act of tremendous grace and mercy on his part, Joseph forgives his brothers of the wrong that they did, and he saves them by giving them food and by welcoming them into Egypt. So the families of his brothers migrate to Egypt and they settle down there. Now, what happens over the generations? What happens after this to the people of Israel in Egypt? Well, at first it seems like things go pretty well for them. They have a favored status there. They increase numerically. They seem to prosper there. But eventually, their fortunes change, and they become slaves in Egypt. They experience oppression and even genocide. The Egyptian king will eventually try to wipe them out as a people. What accounts for this dramatic change from being a favored group to one that now is enslaved? What happens there? Well, a key verse in the narrative happens in Exodus 1:8. In Exodus 1:8 it says these words, "Then a new king who did not know Joseph took the throne in Egypt." And so what that suggests is that a new king who didn't see the Hebrews as a favored minority group now oppresses them and makes them his slaves. And a lot of people wonder about when this could have happened historically. And probably a plausible time frame, even though the Bible doesn't give us historically concrete details about when it actually took place, a plausible scenario is in the 13th century, in the 1200s, under the reign of King Ramses II. It was at this point that the enslavement of the oppression of the Hebrew people comes to a crisis point, and the Exodus takes place during his reign, perhaps. And a lot of scholars give the date of 1250 as sort of a good approximate date for the time of the Exodus. Now, as I've already mentioned, Moses is the major human character in this narrative. Now, as a sort of a side note, the major character in this narrative is God himself. The story centers around God and what he does for Israel throughout. But as far as human characters go, Moses certainly takes the center stage. And the Bible makes it clear that God had an important mission for Moses. And there are several places in the narrative that show that God directs events in the life of Moses to accomplish what he's going to accomplish through him. One way in which God's providence is shown is in the dramatic events surrounding Moses' birth. Pharaoh at the time issued a decree that all Hebrew baby boys were to be killed. Moses is born. His mother hides him. And when she can no longer do so, she desperately does the only thing that she can think of to somehow preserve his life. She puts him in a basket and places him in the Nile River. Miraculously, the basket is found by Pharaoh's daughter, who takes Moses in, raises him in the court of the Egyptian king. Now, the Bible is very clear as it tells the story. This is not simple coincidence, not simply good fortune. Rather, God is directing these events. Not only is the life of Moses preserved, but he's also placed in a unique position that would prepare him for his future calling. Moses had a kinship with the Hebrew people. He was one of them, but he was raised as an Egyptian. And I think that this access to power would certainly provide him with special qualifications for the task to which he would be called. Another crucial moment for Moses in the biblical narrative is his flight from Egypt. One day Moses sees a Hebrew worker being harshly treated by an Egyptian taskmaster. Moses intervenes and kills the Egyptian. And because of his crime, Moses goes into hiding into the desert of Midian. Now, why does the Bible tell this story about Moses? This is kind of an unflattering story. Why not just kind of just write it out of the biblical story? I think in part it is important for establishing why Moses has to leave Egypt only to return later as God's agent of liberation. I think it kind of helps fill in the gaps of that part of the story. But I think another reason, maybe more important, is that it foreshadows Moses' future role. Moses was raised as an Egyptian, but this episode demonstrates that Moses had a heart for justice, and that God would find in him someone with a similar concern about standing up for the oppressed. And I think this episode reveals something about Moses' character. He is concerned about justice, and I think it's going to be important for understanding the rest of this story. During his time of self-imposed exile, Moses enters the household of a priest of Midian. He marries one of his daughters and works as a shepherd caring for his flock. And one day as he was out tending the flock in the desert, Moses comes upon an unusual sight, and that he sees is a burning bush. This bush was on fire, but it's not being consumed. And as Moses approaches to see what's going on there, a voice calls out to him, and this is the voice of God, and it says, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Now this episode is known as a theophany. This is a moment when God makes an appearance among human beings and reveals himself to him. And it is here that God gives Moses his commission. God tells him the plight of the Hebrew people in Egypt. And he tells him about his plan to bring his people out of Egypt. And he tells him that Moses, he himself, would be the one who would go to Pharaoh, he would announce God's plan, and he would lead the people out of their slavery. It's also in this part of the story that the name of God is revealed. In Hebrew, the name for God would be the equivalent of, in English, our consonants YHWH. Now, Hebrew, interestingly, was a language that did not include vowels, only consonants. Vowel markings were added later based upon the way the words were spoken, but since in Hebrew tradition the name of God is sacred and was never to be uttered, there's actually some uncertainty about how this name would have been pronounced, but most interpreters seem to think that it was probably pronounced as Yahweh. Now, what was this word in the Hebrew language? Yahweh is a form of the Hebrew verb of being, which we would translate as to be. And the form that it takes here in this story is indefinite, which means that it could be translated as I am. It could also be translated as I was or I will be. Now, what does this signify? What's the significance of this? Why is the God of Israel, why does he take the name of a verb of being? Well, I think it says something about the constancy of God. He is the same today as he was in the past, the way will be also in the future. God is ultimate reality. God simply is. And I think that's a pretty significant meaning for this name, which really is a verb. Now note also in this episode that God says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Yahweh is the creator of all. God simply is. But in a special way, he is also the God of Israel, the God of their founding fathers. And even though the people of Israel had forgotten about God, God had not forgotten about them. And he was about to act in a very special way in their experience. He was about to renew his ancient relationship with them. Now, in addition to Moses, Pharaoh is the other major human character in the narrative of the Exodus. Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. This was the name for the king of Egypt. And something that's important for understanding the role of Pharaoh in the story of the Exodus is to know something about royal ideology in Egypt. How did the Egyptian people regard their kings? And one of the important things about Egyptian history is that the king was thought of as a god in Egyptian theology. And he was a god who had the responsibility of preserving the cosmic order, which the Egyptians referred to as Ma'at. He was the one, essentially, who made sure that everything went smoothly. He was the one who made sure that the farms produced, that there was prosperity in the land, that there was good rule in the government. He was the one who was responsible for preserving cosmic order. That was his responsibility. Now, in this story, God has a plan for Pharaoh. And that plan for Pharaoh is to know that Yahweh is God. So Pharaoh thinks of himself as a god. He thinks of himself as the one who is providing all the blessings in a way for the people of Egypt. But the whole point of this Exodus narrative is that he will come to know that he actually is not God, and that Yahweh is God. And this is going to be the thing that he is going to learn throughout the course of events. Now, the plagues in this story are something that are things that are meant to teach Pharaoh this lesson. They are to demonstrate who really controlled the natural world. And so you think about all the plagues. You could read through the Exodus narrative to see these plagues. But basically what they do is they subvert the natural order of things. They show nature in chaos. And remember back to what I was saying about the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order. The Pharaoh was supposed to preserve cosmic order. But now these plagues show that the natural world is not orderly as it's supposed to be. And so this is a reflection upon Pharaoh. He's not doing what he is supposed to be doing. And it reveals to him that it is truly the God of Israel who is God and not he himself. Now, the last of the plagues, which is designed to show who truly is in charge of the cosmic order, is the plague of death. And this is the plague in which all of the firstborn of the Egyptian firstborn are put to death by the angel of death. Now, one of the things I think that comes up as we look at this story from a modern perspective is how can we explain God's use of violence here in this story? And I think one of the conclusions we have to draw, or one of the observations we can make, is that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, God uses violence when the weak and the oppressed are being exploited by those who are in power. And I think that applies here in this situation. The Egyptians are oppressing the people of Israel. They're weak and powerless, and God intervenes to save them. But another observation we can make is that the emphasis in the biblical story is not so much upon the punishment to the Egyptians, but rather that God saves the Israelites. And he saves the Israelites. That's the point of the story. God's salvation of the Hebrews comes about when they are instructed to sacrifice a lamb and put the blood of that lamb over their doorposts. And in that way, God saves and preserves the lives of the Hebrew people. Now, the Passover in Israel then becomes an annual festival that would be observed every year by the people of Israel to remember this great act of God's mercy and salvation of his people. But one of the things that's kind of important for us as we try to understand what the Passover meant was that the Passover is simply a remembrance of a past event. Every year that the people of Israel celebrated the Passover was not simply looking back on a moment in history as sort of a history lesson, but rather the idea was that they were actually participating anew in this great act of God's deliverance. They themselves, just as God had acted in the past, they themselves in the present could expect God's act of salvation and love and mercy and liberation in their own experience. And so for all through the history of Israel, this is the Passover, sort of their formative event, and it helps them to realize that God also in the present would also act in new ways to liberate and to save them. And so it's for this reason that Christ's death has Passover significance. Remember that Christ celebrates his Last Supper with his disciples, which is the Passover meal, and he is crucified during the week of Passover. And this is to indicate that, just as God acted in the past to liberate his people, God also acts in new ways to liberate his people, and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is seen in this way. The book of Exodus is named after the Exodus event, but that's not the only thing that we find in this book. Let me mention just two other important elements in the book of Exodus briefly. Beginning in Exodus chapter 19, we find a section of the book that deals with the covenant that God makes with Israel. Now, a covenant is a formal relationship that's established between two parties. And in the ancient world, there were two different kinds of these covenants. One was called a parity covenant, which is an agreement made between two equal parties. In Israel's case, they enter into what is called a suzerainty covenant. This is an agreement between two unequal parties, between a sovereign ruler and his people. In this case, God is the sovereign. He is seen as the king of Israel, and he establishes a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai following their departure from Egypt. Now, in this covenant, God promises to be their God, take care of them, and to protect them, and to provide for them. And reaching out in this way to Israel is seen as an act of grace on God's part. But in return, Israel is expected to remain faithful to Yahweh. And what this means then is not to serve any other gods, but also to treat each other in a way that God desires, to treat each other with justice and concern for the weak and the needy among them. And it's these two basic principles that are outlined in the collection of the laws of ancient Israel. As part of their covenant agreement, Israel pledges to keep the law that God gives to them. In the Old Testament, there are 613 laws, and part of these are found in Exodus and the Ten Commandments, and in chapters 21 to 23, which is referred to as the Covenant Code. But the rest of the law is found in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But it was believed that all of these laws were given by God to Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. Now, as complex as this law code may appear to us from our modern perspective, how complicated it is to follow 613 laws, it's important to keep in mind that they were simply a way of expressing those two basic principles, the idea of faithfulness to God and the proper treatment of one another. Now, in the golden calf incident, Israel breaks their covenantal agreement with God almost immediately after entering the covenant. And I think the point of that story is that disobedience is part of the experience of God's people from the very beginning of their history. The ongoing narrative throughout the rest of the Bible is a narrative of God and Israel and a recurring cycle of Israel's disobedience, but God's fullness to his people. Israel may not be faithful, but God is. And so the idea of covenant and law is another major theme of the book of Exodus. Now, one more thing I'll mention briefly is that the book of Exodus also devotes a substantial amount of space to instructions about the tabernacle, how it should be furnished, and so forth. The book of Exodus discusses this in a lengthy section from chapter 25 to the end of the book in chapter 40. Now, the tabernacle was a portable tent that served as a meeting place between God and Israel. It was the place where the sacrifices were made, and would eventually provide the model for the temple, the permanent structure that's built under King Solomon in Jerusalem. The tabernacle, however, was portable. It could be taken down and moved as the people moved, and this was fitting for their time in the desert before they actually settled into their land. But I think there's a great deal of symbolic importance in this idea of the portability of the tabernacle. The portable tabernacle was a reminder to Israel that Yahweh, as the God of the universe, cannot be confined to one place. Rather, God is mobile. He is with his people. He dwells with them wherever they go. And I think that this is an aspect of the book of Exodus that's important with regard to the tabernacle. It's the idea that God is with his people. And when it comes for the temple actually to be built, that permanent structure, the Hebrew Bible actually notes a bit of hesitancy about this. God doesn't necessarily think that a permanent structure is a good thing. A permanent structure is easy to idolize. It's easy to come to the misunderstanding that God lives there and is confined to that space. But God preferred Israel to have a tabernacle because it reminded them of important aspects of his nature. God is mobile. He goes with his people. So this has been just a brief overview of the book of Exodus. Let's just conclude by summarizing a few of the key points we want to take from this brief overview. First of all, the book of Exodus is foundational for the faith of ancient Israel. And one of the reasons that it's foundational for the faith of ancient Israel is that it narrates the Exodus event. This is the formative event in the experience in the life of the people of Israel. And it was one that was re-experienced annually in the Passover celebration. And the idea was that just as God acted for us in the past, so also he will do so again in the future. He will show grace and mercy, and he will liberate us also once again. The book of Exodus is important because it narrates the idea of covenant. God establishes a covenant with his people. And this shows that God is relational, and it also shows that he is faithful. Whereas Israel may break the covenant, God is faithful to his side of the covenant. It also puts emphasis on the moral responsibility of Israel. Israel has expectations that God wants them to live according to. He has a law for them, and they are responsible to keep that law. The book of Exodus is also important with regard to what it tells us about the tabernacle. And I think the symbolic importance of this emphasis is the idea of God's continuing presence with his people. Thank you for your attention in this brief overview of the book of Exodus.